Hello, welcome to Voices for Justice. My name is Sharon Racusin. The focus of this show is to give voice to all the social, economic, and environmental justice work that's being done in the Upper Valley, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and to highlight how each issue is connected to the other. Ultimately, I'd like to promote the need to work together for the common good, for our human rights, and for the planet. At the end of each episode, there will be some contact information, and I urge you to get involved. Enjoy the show. Good afternoon. It's Sharon again, Voices for Justice, in the studio in White River Junction, CATV 8. And with me today is Dr. Fran Brokaw and Reverend John Gregory Davis, pastor of the Meriden Church.
Meriden Congregational Church.
Thank you. Yes. Both are on the planning committee of SURJ, which is Showing Up for Racial Justice. And I'm a co-founder of the chapter in the Upper Valley, and I welcome you both here. We've been planning this for a long time. And we're going to talk about racism. Not an easy subject to talk about anywhere. It's something we've been talking about a lot. And let's just dive right in and talk about what racism is and how we've played a part as white people
it's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting us. I would say that when most people hear the word racism, they think Ku Klux Klan, they think Aryan Brotherhood, they think David Duke. They don't think of themselves, and they find it really insulting and scary to think of themselves as racist. Or if anybody says, all white people are racist, that's really a scary and dangerous thing to hear for us. And I would say that's really the way I viewed it until a couple of years ago when I started reading more and learning more and took a class, Difficult Conversations About Race. So that's one form of racism, and it's like the very tip of the iceberg. Right. It's not the most dangerous type or the most prevalent type of racism. So then there's racism that's institutional systemic racism is probably the most common and prevalent and the most, pervasive and oppressive.
Insidious, yes. Yeah, and I think that as Fran said, one of the confusing things is that, especially for white folk, for well-meaning white folk, we immediately want to say, well, I'm not racist. And we think that ends the conversation. What we fail to realize is that whatever we may be like as individuals is only part of the problem. It would be entirely possible, theoretically, for me to be as non-racist as possible as a person, but I still live in a racist society. Right. And unless I'm actively working to dismantle racism, I am, for all intents and purposes, cooperating with and perpetuating racism.
Right. I mean, and what we call that more often, and lately, we've talked a lot about white privilege. Yes. And that is the institutional part of it. Yeah. It is going through our lives from birth until however old we are now, and for many, literally centuries, we have just failed to see how other people are being oppressed. And that is the institutional part of it that has kept us deliberately divided so that we can't see, we don't want to see, and we literally can't see it. Mm-hmm. It's the other side of the tracks. It's invisible to us.
Well, right? I like that word deliberate, because it's been a revelation to me to realize that we have been, as white people, we have been deliberately miseducated. We've been educated to, the only things we've learned are the things that value our people, if you will, and the stories, the realities of people of color have been edited out of our of our education. And indeed, part of my awakening was to realize, and somehow it's stunning to me that it never occurred to me, that as a white person, I go through society as if my life is the norm. And it never occurred to me that people of color have to live in two worlds. They live in the world of being a person of color, and they have to know how to live in our white world as well. I don't need to know how to live in their world because my world is the world, the norm.
Right, and even if you are a person living in of little means, you still have more, as a white person, still have more privilege than a black person.
Or
of this.
different privilege. I mean, there is, I'm sort of uber privileged. I have almost every type of privilege except for privilege of gender.
I have that one. Got that covered.
So, you know, I grew up
ultimate
middle class,
privileged person.
educated, and white, and that's where I am now. And you just don't realize where that places you in society, because it's like being, I think the best metaphor for me is that it's like being a fish in water.
Right.
The fish doesn't notice the water.
Yep, that's right.
Unless something sort of lifts the fish out, and then of course the fish can't breathe, but also it's aware that, oh, all this is happening. And that's sort of what it feels like when you suddenly actually become aware of the privilege and advantages that white skin gives you. A good example of systemic racism is after World War II, when the returning GIs with the GI Bill were offered low-cost mortgages, and that's where a lot of our families probably got their
my father
inherited
went to
wealth.
GI Bill, went to college.
Yeah, my parents bought a house on the GI Bill, and
so did my parents.
yeah,
So did my
yeah.
parents.
So but what happened was that the areas where it was possible for people of color to buy a house, and they really were systemically ruled out in many areas. But in the areas where they could buy a house, those were called, quote, redlined districts. And the congressional bill from the Federal Housing Authority basically said, no mortgages in these places, it's too high risk. So those people didn't have the option to benefit from the GI Bill.
Right.
And part of my awakening around that has been that I'd heard of redlining. I was aware that it happened. But I thought it was sort of arbitrary, that it was always understood to be illegal. I never realized it was actually governmental policy. And so the kind of awakening of realizing the extent to which racism has been institutionalized in our governmental policies. And as I was talking with one of my colleagues, and I said, I feel like Rumpelstiltskin, who was just awakened to a world I didn't realize. He asked me the question I continue to be haunted by. He said, what did you think you were seeing? And what I've realized is I was seeing through my lens of privilege, and that was barring me from seeing the reality. And so part of that, again, that's part of the awakening. And for me, really, even the Black Lives Matter movement has been a kind of awakening call.
That's right.
It's kind of put in our face the reality that Black lives have not mattered as much in this country as white lives, and that's a problem.
Right. And then, we have a vigil every Monday night, 5:30 to 6 on the corner of the Dartmouth Green, for Black Lives Matter. And one of the signs that we have is, when Black Lives Matter, then all lives will matter.
That's right.
And that's a very important nuance, because we've been told all lives matter, but in fact, all lives do not matter.
Right.
And driving while black. That is that's another
Or even living
something.
while black. Or even living while black.
Living while black,
Walking or-
walking. I mean, those kinds of
Standing.
things we take for granted. We never think that the color of our skin will attract police attention.
Right, because it doesn't.
Doesn't.
As the Reverend Tracy Blackman says, who is an African-American pastor in our denomination, the United Church of Christ, she asked the question, how am I to live when the color of my skin is a threat? I can't change that. That's who I am. What am I to do when even that is a danger to you? And that's part of the awakening that we have to look at, is to recognize the ways in which we've participated in that. When we hold the Black Lives Matter signs, one would think everyone would celebrate that. We're not saying Black lives
Right.
don't matter. We're not saying Black lives matter more. And yet some of the reactions we get are stunning. I had one guy actually stop his car and say to me, "But you're white," as if somehow a white person couldn't value Black lives.
Right.
And I heard
Right.
an African-American professor at Princeton speaking, and he said, you know, when I hold a Black Lives Matter sign, I don't hold it because I need to know my life matters. I know that. But I hold a sign to say to you, my white brothers and sisters, your lives do not matter more than mine. And sometimes I wonder if that's why white folk are getting upset, is that somehow it's hitting us right in our privilege, that we've sort of unconsciously accepted that our lives do matter more. And this is challenging that, inviting us really to move to a new place.
Right.
I had an interesting
Right.
experience last week when a car pulled up at the stoplight, and the young man rolled down the window, and he said, well, if Black Lives Matter, why aren't they out here with you? And I said, well, in the first place, I'm out here because Black Lives matter to me. They matter to me because I'm a human being. And,
Right.
and in the second place, maybe they're not out here with us because it's safer for me to be out here holding this sign than it is for them.
That's right.
You
It's
know,
also
they
and-
may get harassed by their colleagues or students if they stand out here, and I don't.
But more than that, I think it is the fact that we as white people are the ones that need to stand up
Right.
or show up, is why we're called SURJ,
Showing up,
showing
yeah.
up for racial
Yes.
justice.
And that's really helpful, Sharon, because you know, the showing up for racial justice is a kind of, I think of it as a kind of parallel to the Black Lives Matter movement, a parallel where white folk have recognized that we have a role to play in dismantling racism. And up until recently, I fell prey to the delusion, now I realize that, or illusion, that white, there's no, we can't talk about racism here because we're mostly all white folk. Well, since the premise of SURJ is that white folk need to be talking to white folk, I've suddenly realized this is a great place to be doing work on dismantling racism because we have a lot of white folk to talk
Yeah,
with.
yeah. I mean, as
Yeah.
reportedly Malcolm X said to someone, a white person who heard him speak and was very moved and went up afterwards and said, you know, I want to help. What can I do? And he said, you go back and talk to your people. And so that's what we're trying to do. Our people, our ancestors, are the people who created this system. They may not have thought they were doing something bad or evil. I'd love to give them the benefit of the doubt, and they thought they were doing the right thing. But the fact of the matter is that what they created is a very racist system. And for it to be taken down and rebuilt in an equitable way, white people have to be in that work. We can't do it alone,
Right.
but we need to be there
And
at
we
the table.
support the Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
We've become allies when we really should be just all human beings. We have to act as allies.
Yes.
That's our role. I mean, the more people that understand what the racist system is, probably the sooner we will start to really dismantle it.
Yes, and I think that one of the challenges for white folk is that we can so easily go to a place of guilt, and we'll even say, don't blame me. I know there's a terrible past, but I wasn't part of it. I didn't create it. And my sense is this guilt doesn't help any of us. But if we can recognize there's a problem, then surely we can embrace the responsibility to be part of solving the problem. And I think the other piece that's so important is that we're really talking about a kind of collective liberation here. One of my favorite quotes comes from an Aboriginal Australian woman who says, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that's, I think, what's so exciting about this. We have the opportunity to work together to make the world a better place.
Absolutely. That is a perfect segue to the next segment. So we're going to take a little break and be right back.
Okay.
And we're going to talk about why SURJ is in one of the whitest places in the country, and what our work is and why the three of us are doing it. So we'll be right back. Thank you.